So in this video, we'll be looking at the European uh, incursions and infiltrations, intrusions into largely the rest of the world. Specifically, we're going to focus on China, India, Japan, and Africa. Again, as Europe is industrializing, this means that they are more easily able to uh, exert themselves on the world stage and do so in a more direct way and intrusive way that is going to lead to the creation of more kind of modern concepts of imperialism that will get us towards the dawn of the 20th century. So we'll examine the process by which this happened. We'll look at the reactions to, excuse me, imperial consolidation. Uh, in China, this would mean the European involvement. And by European, I'm talking about British involvement in the Opium Wars, as well as the kind of administrative impotence, as it's best described within the Chinese state. And so, what you have here is, with regard to the experiences in China, the Qing dynasty is beginning to atrophy in place, being able to not even project its authority within its own borders at the almost the exact same time that European powers are beginning to turn a more concerted eye towards China and also begin to impose themselves more directly. In Japan, we'll see the fall of the Tokugawa order. This occurs in 1868 and is followed on by what's called the Meiji Restoration. We'll examine the process by which this happens. Japan has a front row seat to what's happening in China during this period of time, and many of the powers that be in Japan did not want to, uh, suffer the same fate as Qing dynasty China was. And so, really, Japan and its authorities are going to have to endure, being caught on their heels, so to speak, in order to kind of play the long game of catching up with the West and beginning to, in essence, become an imperial power themselves, which by the end of the century, by the end of the 19th century, Japan would be well on its way to achieving. In India, we'll take a very brief look at Queen Victoria's reign there and how Britain really becomes the chief authority within India itself, and also how Britain is going to uh, retain control over the industrial process and thus kind of really keep colonized people or people that fall within the borders of these global empires, forever at the mercy of those European powers, at least again until the turn of the 20th century. In Africa, we'll see and describe the experiences of what's called the scramble for Africa, as again, European powers begin to carve up the entire continent into various spheres of influence. So, looking uh, at China first and foremost, since about the 1820s, opium smuggling had been an increasingly chronic problem within China itself. There was the continuous illegal importation that was coming of opium that was coming from British held India. Efforts on the behalf of Chinese authorities to work with the British to try and curtail the trade broke down. And as a result, Chinese authorities begin to take matters into their own hands. One of these individuals was a man by the name of Lin Zhi, the Qing imperial commissioner. He began to seize chests of opium And in 1838, he was chiefly responsible for destroying some 3 million pounds of raw opium in that single year alone. This happened within the sole port that European powers had available to them as far as engaging in trade with China, that being the city of Guangzhou. Because of this event in 1638 and because of the growing tensions between British authorities and the Chinese themselves, this would result in war, in what's known as the Opium War of 1841 to 1842. This would be an overwhelming British victory and lead to the capture of several port cities along the Chinese coast. The British forces were able to block the Grand Canal, which would heavily affect internal trade within Qing Dynasty China itself. And because of the sheer dominance that Britain enjoyed and the utter complete victory that it had um, exacted over China itself, the treaty resulting from the Opium War became what serves as a template really for what become known as unequal treaties. The terms of the treaty ending this Opium War included the following. First and foremost, Hong Kong, the city of Hong Kong, was ceded to Britain. And it wouldn't be until 1999 that Hong Kong would be returned to Chinese authorities. China was to pay indemnities to Britain for wartime costs. Again, that's pretty standard for most kind of peace treaties during this period of time. That the defeated um, people or state would pay the costs for the war, um, and the war costs for the victor. 5 additional ports along the Chinese coastline would be opened to British trade. And also, there would be the establishment of uniform import tariffs that would be collected not by Chinese tax collectors, but by British tax collectors in China. So, really, what this means is that in many cases, China begins to be stripped of its own legitimacy, its own governing ability and sovereignty within the borders of its own country. Another key factor that was built into this, very closely aligned, and kind of another example of the lack of authority that the Chinese governors had within their own country, was seen in the use of the installation of what's known as extraterritoriality. So this is in essence where British officials, British citizens living within China, again serving as envoys or serving as commercial merchants or entities to conduct trade between the two countries. The British citizens living in the country of China were not going to be subject to Chinese law, that they would be, in essence, tried for any potential crimes committed in China by British law. And so, as a result, it's another example of the loss of sovereignty within China, the inability of the Chinese state to project its own uh, uh, governing authority within its own country itself. This idea of extraterritoriality would epitomize unequal treaties, and it would also be something that not only Britain would begin to put into effect, but very quickly other European powers would want drafted into their own treaties, not only with China, but with any other power that they wish to exploit or any other um, uh, you know, area of the globe that they wished to exploit. Another aspect of this treaty was the condition of what's called the most favored trade status. This was a stipulation that if China extended more favorable terms of trade to another country other than Britain, then those same terms of that commercial treaty between China and the other power would exist and be applied to trade between China and Great Britain. And also, as a result of the Opium War, its decisive British victory here, the opium trade itself would continue. So this set a precedent, to say the least. And by 1844, the United States was able to win similar concessions from China. Not necessarily the rights to sell and trade opium, but to practice concepts of most favored nation trade status, extraterritoriality, and begin to implement their own unequal treaties. France, too, by 1844, did much of the same with regard to China, each in their own separate treaties. This would become the model in diplomatic negotiations between primarily the states of the West, the United States, but also European powers and China, and also those same Western powers and Japan. And so China here was perpetually victimized by these turns of events. Japan tried to um, uh, turn these unequal treaties into opportunities for self empowerment and self improvement. So, and this comes down to the sheer strength and will of the governing state itself with regard to China and Japan. So, China, with a state system that was increasingly weak, as moving forward from, the early 19th century up until the end of the Chinese dynasties in 1911, what you're going to see is that China was really devoid of any type of uh, effective governing control. That it was just incapable of really overseeing the affairs of its own domestic or international type of influence. Now, Japan was suffering the same fate, but within a century. By mid 19th century, Japan was, and we'll see examples of this in a few moments. Japan was, kind of going down the same path as China, but as a result of the Meiji Restoration, Japan is going to pivot and begin to modernize itself in such a way that it is going to, by the end of the century, turn itself into and kind of reinvent itself as an imperial power uh, that was a regional power that was going to be able to rival that of uh, European powers at the dawn of the 20th century. So much the same kind of experience, but very different fates or outcomes between that of China and Japan. Towards the mid and latter portions of the 19th century, as kind of an example of the lack of governing authority within domestic China, you have what's known as the Taiping Rebellion. You can see here lasting from 1850 to 1864. Uh, the founders of this rebellion included Hong Zhuiquan and Feng Yuanzhan. Uh, Essentially, those leaders of this movement, this insurrection, uh, founded their rebellion on a Christian inspired um, interpretation of faith. They saw the Qing dynasty and its supporters as the manifestation of evil itself. There was a strict sense of uh, morality Within the camps of these rebels, there was a strict segregation of the sexes between men and women. There was the forbidden use of opium and corruption, any manifestation of corruption within the rebel communities was punishable by death. So there was an extremely strict morality, that played or was witnessed and adhered to within the rebellious sections of China itself. Uh, This is in part the rebellion erupts also, it should be noted, in part due to the simple frustration of the Chinese people themselves at the inability of the Chinese state to protect the interests of the Chinese people themselves and also to present themselves in an effective way on the international stage. You can see here by nearly 15 years of intermittent warfare that this rebellion just simply continued to manifest itself and erode the s- the strength and the wealth of the Qing dynasty. That the in many cases those forces that were sent out to crush the rebellion were either bought off, and just simply ignored the threat. Some defected to the Taiping Rebellion and its code, but it was also quite costly as far as lives were concerned. Over 20 million people perished as a result of this conflict. By the latter portions of the 1850s and into 1860, during the Taiping Rebellion itself, uh, you have more unequal treaties being imposed on China. One of the best examples of this event was the Treaty of Taizhen, where British, French, and Russian um, diplomats were able to forcibly or at least win concessions, opening 11 more ports um, to those Western powers. So, what you have here is the expansion of trade, that China had lost the ability to manage its interactions with these European powers and Western powers more broadly, and which it had prided itself on, dating all the way back to the Han and Ming dynasties. And so, again, the Chinese here are not able to, kind of oversee or enact their own, and even act on their own interests. Customs service within this treaty also um, would be headed and staffed by foreigners, much in the model of the British under the treaty that ended the Opium Wars. These uh, foreign envoys or officials overseeing international trade within the borders of China itself would be responsible for directing Chinese trade. And it also legalized the importation of opium, which continued to undermine Chinese resolve. Any Chinese resistance was met with repression. In 1860, the British were um, forces ended up occupying Beijing, and during that period of time, they also burned the Summer Palace. And so, as a result, I mean, the again, European and Western powers were just running roughshod over China um, with impunity, largely throughout the 19th century here. And these conditions would last into the 20th century, in which acts and policies would become increasingly codified, again through the ratification, the installation of various treaties. Towards the close of the 19th century, um, in 1894 and 1895, you have a war erupting between the Chinese and the Japanese themselves in what's known as the Sino-Japanese War. The main pivot here, the main bone of contention is Korea and the Korean Peninsula, um, and who had sovereignty over it. Again, Japan, seeing that there was an opportunity here to wrest control from China, was by the 1890s able to, or in position to really kind of exploit the weakness of their um rival and neighbor. There was a swift series of victories for Japan on land and sea, which would result in yet another unequal treaty for China, in which China was to cede the island of Taiwan to Japan. And you can get a sense of that by this graphic here on the slide. Also, the Liaodong Peninsula in southern Manchuria, this area here, was to be ceded to Japan as well. Korean independence was recognized, but Japan had more Chinese port cities opened to Japanese trade. And China, of course, was to pay indemnities to Japan for Japan's wartime losses. What the Sino Japanese War does is that it really is one of the first or an early example of how far Japan had come. And we'll get into this later on in this lecture. And it really began to raise the eyebrows of European powers. Uh, as a result of the overwhelming success that the Japanese enjoyed during this period of time in the Sino Japanese War, Europeans, not to lose the initiative, um, quickly resorted to installing or implementing the tripartite intervention. So this is where Russia, Germany, and France compelled Japan to, at the very least, return the Liaodong Peninsula. Again, this area, this geographic region here in southern Manchuria, return that to China in exchange for additional indemnities that China would pay to Japan, and that worked. From from 1896 to 1899, Russia, France, Germany, and Great Britain continued to exploit China, extending loans to the Qing dynasty at a 4 to 5% interest rate, which was excessively high during that period of time. Russia also began or expanded its role by gaining rights to operate its Trans Siberian Railroad uh, across Manchuria. So again, that the another vivid example of the inability of China to oversee its own domain and dominion. Just really in the tail end of the 19th century, by 1899, the United States was also in itself positioned to become more of a vocal, active member, you might say, of the international community. And this is best exampled with regard to relations with China in what's known as the open door policy. This was a policy initiated by the then U.S. Secretary of State, John Hay, and this note, basically a diplomatic communique, secured uh, agreement from the great powers of Europe and the United States to observe various spheres of influence within respective portions of China itself. So the United States and John Hay here were realizing that uh, you know really the European powers themselves were carving up China into commercial spheres of influence, and the open door policy was an explicit statement saying, "Look, let's not step on each other's toes. Let's agree to recognize, each other's." Area of influence within China itself, and so that we can maintain peace between ourselves in order to exploit the wealth of China itself. And this was a very coy kind of diplomatic maneuver on the part of the United States, symbolizing its arrival on the international stage. And it was an agreement that the U.S. and European powers were willing to buy into and observe. So what we'll do is, with the time remaining, I've got about 5 minutes or so left in this segment. We'll begin to turn attention towards events in Japan during the 19th century. So where we left off when we were talking about Japan last time, we were talking about the maturation and the kind of pressures that were building within the Tokugawa state, and how, in many cases, it was the Tokugawa socio political system that was not going to be able to maintain control or keep up with the pace of change, specifically within the economic and financial spheres. On the international stage, however, the Tokugawa system prided itself on maintaining closed borders by and large, or at the very least, excessively regimenting and regulating contact with the wider world. Again, this led to the limiting of knowledge of the wider world, to their interactions with the Dutch scholars, as they were known. That the Dutch had access to provenance over a small island in the southern portions of the Japanese home islands that they could use as a port facility, a point of contact with Japan itself. And so it was mainly through that single point of contact that Japanese intellectuals were able to keep up with world events, but it was very limited. It was also here that the Japanese were able to begin to process and translate works on Western knowledge, scholarly knowledge, and things or fields such as astronomy, chemistry, geography, mathematics, physics, and military matters, which would include the specifics. Um, Technologies such as ballistics, metallurgy, and military tactics. What this all did was it made Japan the most learned of Asian powers with regard to Western science, which might sound very kind of forward thinking. But again, this is only through a very limited interaction, which should be kept in mind at all times. So the Tokugawa order was able to maintain this kind of uh, protective sphere for itself, but the order was beginning to show signs of weakness, um, and they were beginning to lose the initiative in dictating interactions with foreigners. Russia, for its part, sought trade relations, and soon after, the first Russian ships began appearing in the northern islands and off the shores of um, the Japanese home island of Hokkaido, the northernmost home island, um, and also the experiences, having again a very front row seat to the events of the Opium Wars from 1839 to 1842, where Britain was dictating terms um, in matters of foreign relations to China itself. This, was something that Japan was well aware of and also was pretty apprehensive about. So I'm going to pause here, marking the end of our part one. I'll return with part two to pick up moving forward.